Hi everyone and welcome. I've been looking at a website, Erara, provided by Martin, and it has some really fascinating old books from hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And I came across this book and I thought it would be interesting to read. Got about 20 pages in and it's so fascinating. I thought rather than doing notes on it, I'll just do the video. The terms of use, I can download it for free. The institution that did supply it on the website say it's available to use for free, commercial, uncommercial, as long as the link's provided. So the link is there, and I'll also put it at the bottom of the video as well. And the book is by Edward Cressy, who's an architect and civil engineer. It was printed in London for Longman, Brown, Green and Longmans in 1847. So I thought that this video I'll just read the preface and the contents so you get a rough idea of what it's about, but it's truly fascinating. So what I can say is it gives a lot of explanation about a lot of the things everyone's looking into and talking about at the moment, but doing it by trade anyway, I just find it really fascinating. So I was going to read it out loud. So here we go. Civil engineering must almost necessarily have been coeval with the world's existence, and that its practical usefulness was fully appreciated by the ancients seems to be shadowed forth in one of the earliest fables. For when the waters which covered Thessaly were to be drained, and land rendered serviceable for agriculture, and the air freed from miasma and pestilential vapours, no mortal could be found competent to perform the task, and Hercules was implored to cut off the Hydra's head, or to dam up the watercourses which were the cause of the inundation. But vain were the several first attempts of the hero to destroy the enemy. 2 heads appeared for every one removed, and until the method of searing up the wound was discovered, he failed in accomplishing his purpose. The Phoenicians, Egyptians, Greeks and Romans gave active employment to the civil engineer in draining marshes, mining, construction sewers, bridges, aqueducts, baths, amphitheatres, roads, canals, moles, harbours, lighthouses, and so on and so on. Excuse me. The remains of which are not only traceable, but sufficient to justify our conviction that they were executed by a class of men thoroughly acquainted with the principles of geometry and many branches of natural philosophy. After the destruction of the Roman Empire, all engineering works were under the direction and superintendence of the Freemasons, Brothers of the Bridge, and other fraternities, but civil engineering can scarcely have taken its place among the sciences until the desire to recover the submerged lands in Italy called into action the powers of those philosophers and mathematicians of the 17th century, whose writings laid the foundation of our knowledge for hydrodynamics, hydraulic architecture, as practised in Italy, soon spreading over the greater part of Europe. Galileo, Torricelli, Castelli, Guglielmini, Pollini, Manfredi, Zendrini, and others became distinguished for the laws they propounded upon the active properties of water. The torch of theory was then kindled by practice, and again gave back to the artificer a mechanical light more brilliant than they had before enjoyed. In France, Bellador, about the same period, collected all the information that might be useful to the civil engineer, which he published under the title of Architectural Hydraulic, a work deservedly esteemed and considered as the primer of the modern school of engineering in that country. In England, the profession of the civil engineer was scarcely known until the middle of the last century, when an important discovery of an application of steam by James Watt and its rapid development called into existence a new class of mechanics, who gave fresh impetus of manufacturers by the improvement of all kinds of machinery. The vast commercial enterprise which attended this movement and its great success have necessarily led to the enlargement of harbours and the improvement of our inland navigation, and progress too of an enlightened civilization in its regard for the sanitary condition of the empire, regards that our towns and cities shall be amply supplied with water, lighted, drained, and so on, while innumerable other causes are almost daily arising to call for a reconstruction of our quays, bridges, and every other work executed before this great and general movement in civilization was made. During the last half century, hundreds of millions of sterling have been devoted to these important objects, and great as the amount may appear, it is infinitely less than what will be expended upon railroads alone if the country remains at peace and its prosperity unimpaired. Under these circumstances, it will at once be seen for what importance it is that the civil engineer should be qualified to discharge his duty in the great career that lies before him, to enable him to perform his multifarious functions with honour unto himself and satisfaction to his country, is the great object of this encyclopedia, and without further preface, we shall proceed to lay before the reader an outline of its contents and the plan where we have adopted in its compilation. The first portion of the work is devoted to the history of the past, for it has been thought that a knowledge of a manner in which others have accomplished works similar to those we are called upon to execute at once facilitates our labour and inspires us with confidence in what we are about to undertake. In treating of geology, mineralogy, and chemistry, the only aim has been to point out the nature of these subjects and give a general idea of the properties of the materials which form the earth's crust, with an account of their composition as far as it might be generally serviceable, and to those who employ them in the arts of construction or operate them mechanically. Geometry, as the very foundation of the acquirements of the civil engineer, embraces as it does levelling, surveying, and mensuration of planes and solids, trigonometry and all practical applications, drawing perspective, mapping, laying down charts, and all the preliminary steps of great undertakings, as well as their execution, should be made first study of all those who are desirous of becoming acquainted with the other sciences, for without it, in fact, no portion of them can be rightly comprehended. Mechanics are also a most important subject. The ancients, indeed, knew the principles of the inclined plane, the wedge, the screw, the lever, and the pulley, and by their application were enabled to move the vast weights of accounts of which are transmitted to us. But the improvements made in machinery in modern times have undoubtedly enabled us to execute works of vast magnitude with a great saving of manual labour. From experiments from the strength and properties of the metals and the application of geometry to mechanics, we can construct machines which, from their variety of movement and the useful purposes to which they are applied, are inventions and novelties which belong to the present age. The tools and engines employed by the civil engineer are instances of the advancement in this branch of physics. Hydrostatics is with the theory of the motion of fluids, and the various hydraulic machines that have been invented facilitate operations of the engineer in raising water, directing its course hopefully, usefully and efficiently, whether for sanitary, domestic or agricultural purposes, and without an almost complete command over this element, he can scarcely be considered worthy of his high vocation. The nature of the atmosphere and its properties as a moving power has greatly occupied the attention of mechanics in all ages, and its services cannot be too highly appreciated. For the construction of windmills and similar contrivances, numerous experiments have been made, replete the benefit of the millwright. Warming and lighting are daily becoming matters of public attention, and must therefore occupy the consideration of every man's science, but the civil engineer must beware of fanciful theories. Whatever may be his system, it must be based on a thorough knowledge of the elements which he is to direct, and he must never lose sight of the requisite balance to be maintained between the heat generated and the ventilation. Light in our coast has occupied the attention of such philosophers as Professor Faraday, whose interesting discoveries have greatly improved our lighthouses and elevated the subject to important science. Gaslighting has its engineers who have improved the methods of distilling coal and laid down the principles to direct the proportions of every part of the establishment where such works are conducted. Steam, considered as a moving power, is the most extraordinary discovery of this or any other age, but by its applications manual and horse labour have been greatly economised. Machinery of every kind is set in motion, and millions of human beings are transported in short paces of time from one end of an empire to the other. This branch of our subject is unnecessarily tad, particularly deserves our study. Carpentry, which embraces the construction of timber roofs, bridges, centres, scaffolding, and so on, with a thorough knowledge of the use of the properties of timber, has been treated at considerable length, though not more than the importance of the subject demands. Although iron has in its country superseded the employment of timber in many instances, there are occasions in which the carpenter's art cannot be dispensed with. Moreover, the principles embraced by it are also those practised by other artificers, and deserve to be understood, if on that account alone. Masonry, in another branch of artificers' work, necessary to be thoroughly understood by the civil engineer. The construction of every variety of arch and dome occupies several pages, while the mathematical calculations upon the strength of stone and the effects of thrust and pressure are dilated upon in several parts of their work. The examination of the qualities of various stones used in the construction, together with the analysis of them, have been also fully detailed from parliamentary and other documents that may be relied on. As a science, the mason's art has not in this country been made sufficiently prominent, nor excited sufficient interest to call forth a treatise in the subject, but a volume would be necessary to exhibit the varieties of construction, the skill displayed in overcoming the many difficulties that arise, and the gradual progress of this highly important branch of the profession. Stone bridges and the principles upon which they are constructed should be thoroughly studied by the hydraulic engineer, and as they embrace all the knowledge required for the formation of docks, harbours, piers, jetties, quays, and so on, which are among the most triumphant efforts of the engineer. Of the machinery invented to aid these works, and for which we are indebted to the bridge builders of the last century, ample accounts have been made in that portion of the work devoted to the machinery. Stone bridges over the Thames at London are highly deserving of attention. They may be considered as a result of a great study, and the best examples of the application of science to such structures. Canals, thought now to be superseded by railways, ought not on that account to be entirely neglected, for should steam navigation still be further improved, it is not improbable that the data have occasioned their disuse may prove favourable of their future construction, and hence the principles which belong to their formation should be thoroughly understood by the civil engineer, as there are many localities which canals have decided to preference over railways. Draining and embanking have formed a very early period of occupied attention on the government as well as individuals, to confine rivers within their banks, draw off the surplus waters from the surface of the land, are not only benefits conferred on agriculture, but on its cultivators by rendering the atmosphere more sourly and agreeable. Towns and cities also require attention to their sewerage and the cleansing of the streets, and several local acts of Parliament have been passed to enable these objects to be carried out into effect. But one grand comprehensive view is still wanting for this to be thoroughly accomplished, and it will never be attained until the united efforts of a number of engineers well instructed in geology shall suggest that every district the best means of attaining it. Railroads. Having given the extraordinary impetus to the profession, but it is time that the principles of their construction should be better comprehended, the public at whose expense these highly important works have been executed, having hitherto generally performed the mechanic to the artificer, as the director of the chief lines that have been completed. The construction of a railroad requires a great combination of talents before it can be brought to perfection. The selection of the country through which it is to pass, and the building of bridges and viaducts, laying down the rails, and so on, are even more important considerations than the locomotive engine, which draws the vast loads along the line. We have already had numerous failures where the arts of construction have been employed, and it has been desired that the engineers entrusted with the expenditure of such vast sums are embarked in these speculations will qualify themselves at once to comprehend these arts and to practice them beneficially. The principles of proportion, which regulate the quality of material to be employed in the arts of construction, should be diligently studied by the architect and civil engineer. To this subject, Orford has devoted the most careful consideration, having measured the vast number of buildings of all ages for the purpose of forming an opinion upon the difference of the character expressed from the Doric, Ionic, Byzantine, and the medieval styles. For the economic purposes of this inquiry is worthy of great attention, and being apparent that if an entire building or a portion of the Byzantine style be cubed, 1 part out of 12 is only devoted to material. In St George's Chapel, Windsor, 2 parts; in the Chapter House at Wells, 4; in the Ionic porticos, 6; in the Doric, 8; in the variation between a 12th, a 6th, third, a half, and 2/3 of an entire cube being employed for supports, and the remainder for space. On the great features of the age is the division of labour. As the population increases, the influence of knowledge spreads, and it seems likely to be still further carried out. The province of the civil engineer at present extends over the works performed by the artificer, the miner, and mechanic. He is entrusted with the direction of all that is difficult and scientific in construction, whether upon land or water, as well as designing the machinery necessary for the important purposes. This knowledge was formerly demanded of the architect, who in addition was required to be acquainted with the fine arts. His qualifications, according to Vitruvius, were to embrace all that could be known, and many illustration names could be added to prove the requirements of the great Roman architect were fulfilled to the letter. To design an edifice which shall have commodity, firmness, and delight, or to render it both serviceable and expressive of its purpose, requires a variety of talent, and it is to be feared that the architect who confines his attention solely to that proportion embraced by the fine arts will eventually lose his power, for without studying the principles of construction he cannot give character to his design, and is not qualified to be entrusted with the execution of a work. On the other hand, adopted by Sir Christopher Wren, set out upon his travels and examined and studied those buildings which have received the proportion of the most competent judges, and will find the Egyptian, Grecian, Roman, and medieval architecture have each in its peculiar principles and character of expression. Each application is required for a perfect initiation into the knowledge of architecture, as a fine art has for that science of construction. St Paul's, London, which is a masterpiece of construction, gives but too strong evidence that the genius of the mathematician had not profited sufficiently from his journey in search of what was consisted and perfect in architecture, and did not even advance so far as to study his predecessor, Inigo Jones. We admire this splendid edifice, not for his architecture, but for the principles developed in its construction. Those who pass judgment on a design should be in possession of all the elements necessary for such a task. They should be acquainted with construction generally and in detail, and should understand the proper relative proportions of every part of the edifice. The public are enabled to pronounce a Menai bridge to be both beautiful and useful, but before the architect can decide that it is a perfect work of its kind, he must be satisfied not only that every tie rod and strut is tightly proportioned, but that all of them in their respective characters express their functions, producing a whole combining security, solidity, and utility. It's impossible to dismiss a portion of our subject without expressing feelings of the most painful regret at the position which architecture now appears to hold in this country. In France and throughout Europe it occupies its rightful place and achieve its important parts of the arts of design, where the architecture is prepared for the exercise of his profession by a long course of study, tested by strict examinations in elementary mathematics and the sciences of construction, while all the students' talents and energies are called forth by the spirit of emulation, produced by contests for medals and academic honours. Foreign governments powerfully contribute to the encouragement of successful merit by bestowing and endowing academics and professorships which enable the man of science to devote his leisure to the cultivation and advancement of his art. The engineers estimate in its true value the power acquired by a combination peculiarly for promoting the acquisition of that species of knowledge which constitutes the profession of a civil engineer. They have defined the nature and objects of their institution. They encourage the student to cultivate the sciences ancillary to his profession, and by the distribution of medals and prizes for the most able memoirs, incite him into study and description of engineering works at home and abroad. Nor has the means of furnishing the aspirant with opportunities for acquiring theoretical knowledge has been neglected. The College of Civil Engineers, the engineering classes at King's and University colleges, at the University of Durham, communicate much valuable information with what would have been inaccessible for the official workshop. For the architect, no such means are provided, nor has the institution defined the art in a manner to make it public feel its value or necessity. Let the architects follow the wise example of the engineer, and they will have done much to acquire for the art of respect and encouragement of their countrymen, and to place it in the elevated position which elsewhere it so deservedly occupies. For the information contained in this encyclopedia, the author is indebted to several eminent writers and to numerous tours which he made for the express purpose of observing the engineering works of both this country and of the continent. The practical observations are the result of 30 years' employment in his profession, but he has freely borrowed the opinion suitable for his undertaking from every trustworthy source to which he has had access, and more especially from the following foreign authors. A more extended perusal of the earnestly recommends to every student. I'm not going to read that. And so on. The several essays comprised in the something whose names are frequently introduced where this subject is discussed. Alberti all'Architettura, and above all the Opera Vitruvi, Pollionis, edited by Pollini and Stratico, 4 volumes. He has also to acknowledge assistance received from his eldest son, Edward Cressy, whom it has been his wish to qualify for the exercise of the important duties of both architect and civil engineer, and who, while studying his profession, executed nearly the whole of the drawings so ably cut on the wood by Richard R. Branston of St Andrew's Hill, Doctors' Commons, to whom he offers his best thanks for his care and attention during the progress of the work. To conclude, the author's great desire has been to embody the one volume in all its leading principles and multifarious details in which the science of civil engineering is based, and to produce a work that might at once instruct the pupil and prove a useful guide to him in his professional career. The work he believes in the first on the subject, which has been published on this country. The labour bestowed upon its compilation has been no ordinary kind, and he terminates it with regret, feeling assured that one individual could not do justice to a subject involving so many considerations of public importance. Should he, however, be so fortunate as to awaken in the mind of the young engineer a love for his profession per se, and a sense of the honourable position in which he may place himself by careful study and an undeviating course of integrity, he will not think that his labour is in vain. E. Cressy. Sorry, I've got bad throat, chest. So the contents, it goes on about the history of civil engineering, and chapter 1 it's got the Phoenician Chapter 2, Egyptian. And pyramids, Port of Alexandria, which means massive smelting and refining metals in the Egyptian times. Hydraulic architecture, stone quarries, obelisks and bridges in the Egyptian times, with references and stuff too. Grecian, ports of Athens and all them places. Walls of cities, gates, arts of construction. And then chapter 4, Roman construction, walls of cities, construction, gates, and so on. And then down here, tombs for the Romans, Mussolini machines and engines, principles of mechanics, engines for raising water, water mills, water screw, hydraulic organs, sawmills, measuring distances, hydraulic architecture, lazarettos. Chapter 5, Holland and Germany, drainages and bridges. France, ports and harbours, Dunkirk, grave lines, Cherbourg, breakwaters and so on. Havre d'Epée, Marseille. Supply of water, aqueducts, abattoirs, markets, bourse, artisan wells, railroads. America is chapter 7, harbours of Quebec, Halifax, Montreal, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Charlestown, New Orleans, canals, supply of towns with water. This book was released in 1847. Chapter 8, Britain, ports and harbours of, docks of the Thames, Chatham, Shearms, all these towns and places. Walls and gates of cities and towns, castles and so on, bridges, roads, draining and embanking, draining of towns, supply of towns with water, rivers, canals and inland navigation, steam engines, steamboats, locomotive, railroads, atmospheric electricity, telegraphs, gas lighting, prisons and so on. Book 2, Chapter 1. Geology, different strata, water and tidal currents, rivers, formation of deltas, sandbanks, downs, beach, etc. Chapter 2. Composition, use for minerals, mines, strength of metals, coal, fields, boring, and so on, coat making. Chapter 3. Chapter 3. On stone, sandstones, limestones, marbles, granite, resistant of stone to crush. Chapter 4. Bricks and tiles and their manufacture and variety. Chapter 5. Mortars and cements. Chapter 6. Something 7. Something 8. Geometry. Shadows. Seography. Perspective. Isometrical perspective. Levelling and instruments used. Compound levelling. Drawing in the section of profile of a country. Trigonometry. Measuring heights and distances. Pickets. To draw a map of the country. Semicircles, geometric square, sector, astrolabe, compass, magnetic needle, Jacob's staff, plane tables, theodolite, surveying cross, optical square, prismatic compass, sextant, Hadley's quadrant, barometer, chain and offset staff, Gunter's chain, parish surveying, subterranean surveying, maritime surveying, tide gauges, sounding, trigonometrical surveying and signals and their construction, meridian line, mensuration of superficies, and so on, copying and making plans to reduce multilateral figures, triangles and squares, so on, mensuration of solids. Chapter 9, valuation of property, doing groundwork, dredging, fashion work, fencing, carpentry, masonry, bricklayers. Chapter 11, mechanics, physical properties of matter, centre of gravity, action of bodies when placed over each other, equilibrium of an inclined plane, the wedge of the screw, the lever, so on. Plumbers' blocks, friction rollers, changing of motion by several methods. Chapter 12, machines, tools employed by the civil engineer. Chapter 13. Carriages for transporting weights, boats and so on. Wagons, trucks, railway carriages, buffing apparatus, boats for the transport of stone and so on. Machines for proving the strength of materials and so on. Making screw bolts, the lathe, drilling machines, boring machines, machines for punching boiler plates and so on. Riveting machines, shears for cutting iron, slotting and key grooving, screw cutting, cutting the teeth of wheels, planing iron, forge bellows, hammers, block machinery, sawmills, hand mills, horse mills, mills for the grinding of corn, mortar and cement mills, diving bells, pontoons, raising vessels sunk at sea, the hedgehog, floating plough, dredging, artesian wells, boring instruments, machines for measuring the strength of men and animals, the dynamometer. Chapter 14. On piles, pile driving, cutting off the heads and so on, pile engine, withdrawing piles, cutting off piles, steam pile driving. Chapter 15. Mechanical agents, or the first movers of machinery, velocity in which a man moves, daily labour of a man when moving load on a wheelbarrow, and acting on pulleys of a man pushing or drawing, swiftness of men, useful effect of such power, force developed horse considering as a mover, his attractive power, strength of, taken as a dynamic unit, observation on the daily labour of the measure of the greatest effect of an animated mover. Hydrostatic, chapter 16. Level of liquids and their equilibrium, on the vertical action of water against inclined surfaces, centres of impression, specific gravities, and table of. Chapter 17. The theory of motion of fluids, measurement of which water flows through the tubes and pipes, through rectilinear and vertical orifices, through vertical and circular, through orifices under pressure, or the communication of motion of fluids when at rest on the shock of water against the plane surfaces, to find the velocity of a current, motion of water in conduit pipes and canals, quantity discharged by orifices at different forms of vessels kept constantly full, quantity discharged over a weir, on the motion in rivers, Smeaton's experiments relative to undershot water wheels, its dynamic effects, construction of undershot wheels, Barker's mill, tide mills, breast wheels of bodies plunged in water, equilibrium of flotation, sinking bodies, fountain of hero, hydraulic ram, siphon ram, suction ram, Berer's machine, hydraulic cane, machine and violon, centrifugal force machine, Archimedean screw, suction pump, forcing pumps, suction and forcing pump, double piston pumps, chain pumps,